been waiting for all day on the Acela yesterday, reading Kim Strassel's amazing new book, Resistance at All Costs. And by the way, you've got to pre-order this. This book is just in one place, concisely stated, completely framed, is the attack on Trump. Resistance at All Costs by Kimberly Strassel. She's the Wall Street Journal columnist. You've got to read Resistance at All Costs. I just tweeted about it all the way down from New York back to D.C. yesterday. But I was also following the news, and I was being attacked by the left for having Tom Cotton on yesterday, who brought up the rather salacious past of Hunter Biden. And a New York Times person accused me of attacking a candidate's child. That person, Michael Barbero, I know you've never heard his name. I didn't know who he was either because I don't listen to the podcast from the Times. Got dragged by about 3,000 people and mocked relentlessly, including by the Free Beacon. But the key thing is, at the end of the day, yesterday's hearing and the whistleblower complaint before it, summed up by Lindsey Graham yesterday, cut number 20.
The president was between a rock and a hard place. I think he did the right thing. You know, I'll make my own opinions up, and I have, and I'm really clear about this. This phone call is a nothing burger in terms of a quid pro quo. The President of the United States did not remotely suggest to the Ukraine, if you don't do my political bidding against the Bidens, I'm going to cut your money off. He talked to me last night about South Korea needs to pay more. Maybe we should withhold money from South Korea. I said, they probably should pay more, but we shouldn't withhold money because that sends a bad signal to China.
So you see, I agree with Lindsey Graham. This is a nothing burger. So there's nothing at the basis of the latest impeachment outrage except a triggered Beltway media that hates Donald Trump, as explained in Resistance at All Costs by Kimberly Strassel, and a permanent U.S. government that has a mole at the White House who was apparently a CIA officer. I don't know. That's what the New York Times said. He's a CIA officer. I wouldn't have given people... If a genuine whistleblowers need to be protected. I'm not sure this guy's a whistleblower because of this gal, because they're using secondhand information. It's all hearsay. But it's part of the same ball of attacks on Trump that began during the transition, actually began during the campaign orchestrated by Comey and McCabe, as laid out by Kimberly Strassel. I'll get to all that, but yesterday I had General James Mattis on. Maybe you caught the end of my show. I was talking to General Mattis. I also kept him around afterwards because it was my second interview with General Mattis, and this time I wanted to get to everything. Here's a cut from yesterday's off-air conversation with General Mattis. You haven't heard this before? Roll it. General Mattis, something else in call sign chaos, which I did not get to at the Nixon Library, and I kicked myself in the butt for. You killed off Joint Command because of EBO. It is a marvelous case study in having the willingness to confront the obvious malfunction of an idea gone wrong. Would you tell people that story and why the acronym EBO was a menace to the military?
Well, EBO, Effects-Based Operations, was an approach by that command to take a valid, workable U.S. Air Force process to take on, for example, an electrical grid or a railroad grid or a highway grid. And how do you break those grids so that the enemy, the effect on the enemy, is most precise and most compelling? The problem was, at Joint Forces Command, they'd lost sight of the theoretical aspects. And when you don't pay attention to theory, when you don't pay attention to the fundamental nature of anything, then you're going to get in trouble when you start coming up with solutions that violate the fundamental nature, in this case of war, which is fundamentally unpredictable. You start a war, many nations do, and end up losing it. Now, they didn't start the war to lose it. It means that there's something unpredictable by its nature. And so when I realized that intellectually this command was not coming up with sound ideas, we ended up paying a price that you could only see in hindsight. For example, we were still shrinking the size of the U.S. Army as this war against terrorism began, and we saw soldiers going back-to-back 15-month tours because we decided you didn't need a larger army because of these, what I would call bumper stickers. So there came a point when Secretary Gates and Admiral Mullen, the Secretary of Defense, the Chairman of Joint Chiefs, were dealing with some very tough budget issues. And I realized then there was a way to do the good parts of that command and yet disband the overarching organization, which was frankly intellectually not up to the job. so I recommended it go away. The Secretary of Defense, under Admiral Mike Mullen's suggestion, who brought it to him, agreed. And for the first time since World War II, we disbanded a 4-star man that was no longer fit for its purpose.
Now, General, if I can switch to the battles that you recount in Call Sign Chaos with a context that's modern. As soon as I had finished Call Sign Chaos, which is an instant classic in my view, I read Henry Kissinger's On China for a second time because I think they are the American competitor for the next 100, if not 200 years. Are the lessons so hard-earned in the first Gulf War, in Afghanistan, in the Iraq War, and now in the War on Terror, are they applicable to the competition we are in with the People's Republic of China?
Well, they are applicable. However, every conflict, every competition, every adversary, every competitor is unique. So you can't copy them like a template. What you have to do is you have to adapt the lessons that you learned there to the specific situation. And that's why the study of history is so important to leaders, because the study of history will not, in and of itself, give you a roadmap or a plan to be copied. What history will often do is just light that dark path ahead, because there's no other way to light it, really, and tell you what questions to ask, because you'll see how other people successfully or unsuccessfully dealt with a similar situation. For example, there's a model in the 3rd century A.D. of how the Roman Empire dealt with challenging times, where they were having challenging fiscal times, their military was challenged, their diplomats were not respected, and they came through. There were also examples of that under the Sun King in France in the 1700s. And our own country has been through tough times from the Civil War to World War II. So you adapt these lessons learned to the specific circumstance, but there's a great deal of value to studying history, and there's a great deal of danger to ignoring history.
One of the things I studied carefully was your setup of Forward Operating Base Rhino, the largest expeditionary force the United States has ever sent. Was that what you sent from Task Force 78 into the middle of Afghanistan, which has no coast, of course? And then I began to think about China. I don't know that we could ever use an expeditionary force under any circumstance against the People's Republic of China because it is so vast, General Mattis. Am I ignoring the idea that there's always something new under the sun if you use the best from the old books?
Well, I think it was the deepest penetrating amphibious assault in history going into Afghanistan. However, what you have to do is look at the theme of what happened there. How do you penetrate? One point would be expeditionary bases alongside our allies around China would certainly complicate any kind of conflict from China's point of view. It would also strengthen our allies and let them know that we are with them. That would allow diplomats perhaps to help deter a war. We don't want to just deter a great power war. We want great power peace. And part of this is going back to your earlier question, Hugh, about allies. If you have allies, and if they are representative democracies, for example, then by their very existence nearby China, the young people in the streets of Hong Kong today are emboldened. The democracy of Taiwan is strengthened by those other examples around them. So you don't look at the amphibious invasion into Afghanistan right after 9/11 as only a military approach. There are also diplomatic approaches. There are approaches that use information warfare. The penetration may very well be just to show the Chinese people that they deserve a government that does not violate international norms, that they stand to benefit economically, culturally, as a nation, if they have a leadership that listens to the international community, that none of us can go our own way alone in this world. Globalization is not a policy. Globalization's a reality, and China has to deal with that reality as well. So I would move the military example of Afghanistan up to a higher level, perhaps, Hugh, of diplomacy and how we do economic relations, that sort of thing.
More coming up from General James Mattis. I also have Admiral Stavridis. I've got more on the I just think it's nuts what the Democrats are doing, but I hope they vote impeachment quickly. If I were real Donald Trump on Twitter, I'd be urging them to take a vote today. The clown car trying to go up a steep hill, that would be something to watch. Don't go anywhere. Stay right here. It's the Friday edition of the Hugh Hewitt Show.
Portions of the Hugh Hewitt Show are brought to you in part by Citizens for Truth in Drug Pricing.
The Hugh Hewitt Show on the Salem Radio Network returns from break in 4 minutes and 15 seconds. The Hugh Hewitt Show on the Salem Radio Network returns from break in 3 minutes and 45 seconds. The Hugh Hewitt Show on the Salem Radio Network returns from break in 3 minutes and 15 seconds. The Hugh Hewitt Show on the Salem Radio Network returns from break in 2 minutes and 45 seconds. The Hugh Hewitt Show on the Salem Radio Network returns from break in 2 minutes and 15 seconds. The Hugh Hewitt Show on the Salem Radio Network returns from break in 1 minute and 45 seconds. The Hugh Hewitt Show on the Salem Radio Network returns from break in 1 minute and 15 seconds. The Hugh Hewitt Show on the Salem Radio Network returns from break in 45 seconds. The Hugh Hewitt Show on the Salem Radio Network returns from break in 15 seconds. The Hugh Hewitt Show returns from break in 5 seconds.
Welcome back, America. I'm Hugh Hewitt inside the ReliefFactor.com studio in Washington, D.C. I want to go back to one more clip of General James Mattis talking to me yesterday after the show ended. Yesterday, I kept the general on the line so I could get to him to talk to him about a couple of topics which we had not previously done, including China. Here's one more excerpt on China. General Mattis, last week I had a conversation with a very senior retired American diplomat whom everybody respects, who was warning that America has to be very careful not to over-encourage the Hong Kong demonstrators. Tiananmen Square is a bit of history, and President Xi is not going to allow Hong Kong to become an independent state. As you reflect on that, what's your advice to Americans talking about Hong Kong, about how we do it to both stand with that which we believe in, freedom, but not over-encourage what is essentially a defenseless force in the face of a very strong PLA massing on its border?
Yeah, well, it's a good point. This is not something that we are going to intervene in militarily, and so that's why that diplomat probably said we would not want to over-encourage. I think the number one thing we do in a situation like this is make certain our own example here in the United States shows how people govern, shows how people come to compromise, how we understand one another. And this is an area we've got our own problems with right now. But we need to show that democracy is a functioning way to govern, not just to have elections, but after we have elections, that we actually roll up our sleeves and work together to solve problems. And this is a challenge right now, and it's a challenge in France. We can see the challenge in the United Kingdom, and certainly here at home. We have got to find a way to, most of all, give the example of a functioning democracy that's based on respect for everyone's views, that we listen to one another, and then that we act in concert with compromise in order to carry forward the best ideas. And I think that our example is what would be most invaluable to the people in the streets of Hong Kong. We are not going to convince them not to stand up for their own freedom. They obviously have been in the streets for a while, and they've proven that they will stand up for the freedoms they believe they deserve. And remember, Hugh, this is not just an internal problem for China. Remember that back in I think it was in the 1980s, when China came to us for our support for the return of Hong Kong from British control, a vestige of the colonial times, to China. And they promised us at that time it would be one country but two systems. And these problems that we're seeing today, where the people are upset in Hong Kong, stem from a very ill-advised law they tried to force on Hong Kong, which was extradition. In other words, it would not have been two systems. And they gave us their word there would be one country, two systems. They gave the people of Hong Kong their word it would be two systems. And when they start to violate that, we shouldn't be surprised if the people of Hong Kong take umbrage at it and go into the streets. But at the same time, I don't think we should be half-stepping that we believe in democracy and we believe countries should live up to their word when they give it.
That is General James Mattis yesterday. I have one more segment I'll play next hour. I do want to play for you as well another military man, Joseph McGuire. He's now retired from the military. He's the director of national intelligence, talking on the House Intel Committee yesterday with Jackie Spear about a Washington Post, I believe it was a Washington Post report that said he threatened to resign. Cut number 9.
At any point during this process, did you personally threaten to resign if the complaint was not provided to the committee?
No, Congressman, I did not, and I know that story has appeared quite a bit, and I issued a statement yesterday.
All right, thank you. When you read the complaint, were you shocked
right there. Did you
at
hear
all
that?
by what?
She cut him off. No, I never threatened to resign. Then he went on to say this to Jackie Spear, Joseph McGuire, cut number 10.
Did the President of the United States ask you to find out the identity of the whistleblower?
I can say, although I would not normally discuss my conversations with the President, I can tell you emphatically, no.
All right,
Has
so then
anyone else?
Not only did he not threaten to resign, as had been reported, he did not get asked by the president for the identity of the whistleblower. I want you to understand, this is all a nothing burger. But I want them to go forward up that hill of impeachment. I think the president ought to be tweeting, take the vote today, take the vote today, take the vote today. There is no there. And it's just, go get Kim Strassel's book, Resistance at All Costs, pre-order it, and come right back here. Admiral Stavridis is next on The Hugh Hewitt Show.
Portions of the Hugh Hewitt Show are brought to you in part by Birch Gold Group.
The Hugh Hewitt Show on the Salem Radio Network returns from break in 5 minutes and 15 seconds. Hugh Hewitt Show on the Salem Radio Network returns from break in 4 minutes and 45 seconds. The Hugh Hewitt Show on the Salem Radio Network returns from break in 4 minutes and 15 seconds. The Hugh Hewitt Show on the Salem Radio Network returns from break in 3 minutes and 45 seconds. The Hugh Hewitt Show on the Salem Radio Network returns from break in 3 minutes and 15 seconds. The Hugh Hewitt Show on the Salem Radio Network returns from break in 2 minutes and 45 seconds. The Hugh Hewitt Show on the Salem Radio Network returns from break in 2 minutes and 15 seconds. The Hugh Hewitt Show on the Salem Radio Network returns from break in 1 minute and 45 seconds. Hugh Hewitt Show on the Salem Radio Network returns from break in 1 minute and 15 seconds. Hugh Hewitt Show on the Salem Radio Network returns from break in 45 seconds. The Hugh Hewitt Show on the Salem Radio Network returns from break in 15 seconds. The Hugh Hewitt Show returns from break in 5 seconds.
Welcome back, America. It's Hugh Hewitt on this Friday, September 27th. Pleased to welcome back live Admiral James Stavridis, who is the former Allied Supreme Commander of NATO, just a regular weekly guest on this show. And Admiral, welcome back. I know you've been globetrotting. I want to cover three things with you. Your visit to Saudi Arabia, what the E3 did about Iran this week, and then your time in Ukraine when you were the Supreme Allied Commander. So I got to parcel my time quickly. Can you first tell us about what you saw when you were in Saudi Arabia? I think it was there. You were there after the attack by Iran on Saudi Arabia.
Hugh, I actually landed as the drones hit, and off in the distance you could sort of feel the thunder, and I knew at that moment this was going to be a huge event. I mean, this is the center of gravity of the global oil industry, and certainly I would say that immediately you got a sense in Saudi Arabia of extreme seriousness, of extreme nervousness. I had a chance to meet with several of the cabinet ministers. They are 100% focused on this, and it's an existential threat to the Saudis. So they are looking for U.S. support. I think the administration is making a smart move, sending some troops over there to kind of calm the situation a bit, but it's another indication of how dangerous this is in the Middle East, and you and I have been talking about it for months.
Now, Admiral, it was my reading that the Saudi defenses had been built to protect against attacks from Yemen, but these came from a different direction, widely believed to have been from southern Iran. Are there, for example, Patriot missile batteries that can be deployed to protect that flank of the Saudi complex?
Absolutely, and the Patriot is in place around the perimeter of many of these oil fields. But the problem is, Hugh, these drones are smaller, lighter, quicker. When combined with cruise missiles, they can also create a saturation effect. And frankly, the oil fields need to be rebalanced in a military sense so they can protect against what I have called the new strategic triad, which is unmanned vehicles, cyber, and special forces. That's really the threat to these oil fields, not these big lumbering cruise missiles.
Now, in terms of the president's response to date, which has been diplomatic, not kinetic, do you believe we are outside of the zone where a kinetic response is likely, or are we still in that zone?
We are out of the zone for the moment. And observe that the Iranians have been quite careful, actually, not to attack any U.S. personnel. There have been no U.S. deaths here. And to my knowledge, there have been no Saudi deaths here. So the Iranians are moving quite cautiously, making kinetic attacks against tankers, against the oil fields. Where we ought to worry, Hugh, in terms of a kinetic response is if the Iranians cross that line. If there's American troops killed, or there are mariners killed, or Saudis killed in the oil field, I think that's a different ballgame. The Iranians haven't gone there yet.
Right now, Admiral Stavridis, in the Oh, superheated greenhouse of Washington, D.C. Some things get missed. I was in New York yesterday. The UN saw an amazing thing this week. The E3, United Kingdom, Germany, and France, came towards us vis-a-vis Iran. I think that's the most important story of the week. What do you think about it?
I totally agree. And unfortunately, it did get buried under everything happening in Washington. This is a big deal. This is what we've been waiting for. I've often referred to the UK, Germany, and France as the swing voters in this relationship between the U.S. and Iran. Heretofore, those three have maintained faith, if you will, with the broken agreement for denuclearizing Iran. Now, at the UN, because of the attacks on the Saudi oil fields, all three of them have said, this is unacceptable. We will join the United States to put diplomatic pressure on. For the first time, I can see a diplomatic path forward because of this. It's a huge story.
All right, now, in terms of that, how does that manifest next? They kept a little wiggle room. They hedged their bets a little bit, but do we expect them to formally withdraw from the JCPOA and say start over? Because they said sort of two things. One of those was come talk about long-range missiles, the export of terror, regional instability, but maybe the JCPOA isn't dead yet. Well, I think it's dead, but maybe they just don't want to do it diplomatically.
It is dead, and it's a tired debate about whether it was a good deal or a bad deal. Doesn't matter. It's a dead deal. So at this point, you got to play the ball from where it is on the field. I think Macron, the president of France, is the leader in that troika and is going to push it forward. Hopefully we'll see Brexit resolved one way or the other. That'll get the distraction of Brexit off the plates of the Brits, and then I think you'll see the next British government, whoever it is, lean in. That's the moment to watch. So I think late October, early November, hopefully Brexit in the rearview mirror. At that point, watch for the Troika to completely break with the old deal and come to the negotiating table to pressure Iran. That's the only path forward here.
Now, let me switch to your time as Supreme Allied Commander, 2009 to 2013. I think you had left before the protests in Kiev in November of 2013. I know you were gone when Russia invaded in 2014. But can you give us a sense? I assume you traveled to Ukraine. You've been everywhere, right? Like 35 different places in Ukraine. What a mess of a country. It is hard to follow this between 4 different prosecutors, 3 different presidents, a bunch of different scandals. What was Ukraine like when you were the Allied commander in charge of NATO?
You know, it was actually relatively hopeful in the sense that it was a Ukraine that was not invaded by Russia. There was certainly always a bubbling sense of problematic behavior by Russia trying to intrude. And you may not know this, Hugh, but the Russian Black Sea Fleet, even in those days, was actually stationed on Ukrainian soil. And so it was a complex relationship, but therefore the Ukrainians just wanted to be with NATO and wanted to be with the United States. Certainly plenty of corruption floating around, and that was what we tried to do in the military zone, was drive the corruption out. But we saw the Ukrainians deploy forces to Afghanistan with us. They sent a ship on counter-piracy missions. They're a capable, proud people who are just being beaten by a bully in the form of Vladimir Putin. We had to continue to work with them and stand with them, and that's something I'm very proud of in my time at NATO, is building that military relationship and ensuring that the Ukrainians got the support they needed. My successors following the invasion have continued that same track. Ukraine is a vital country in Europe. It's not a NATO member, but it's strategically vital.
Tell me how you would try and fight back against this shadow of corruption. We are focused on their oil and natural gas company right now as having untoward influence in America. We're focused on who got who fired and why and what Zelensky said to President Trump. But if you're running a combined arms campaign such as NATO, how do you keep the people with briefcases of cash from the door?
Well, it's the old line, send money, guns, and lawyers. And it's actually true. What you want to do in the military context is get your military lawyers talking to the legal teams of the Minister of Defense, the legal teams of the military operators, and showing them what's okay and what's not okay. You do want to send guns because that's your motivation. You want to send that military aid, so you have to have that capability. And certainly you've got to ensure that you have the ability to leverage them, show them what's right, and then you can, in fact, go to the Ukrainians, for example, and say, we have got to see an appropriate use of the aid we are sending you and show us where that aid went. That's entirely legitimate. In fact, it's required by law. So the military has a role in anti-corruption. We've done that, Hugh, not only in Ukraine, but in, for example, Central America, in Colombia, in Afghanistan. And there are varying degrees of success. I'll close by saying the one-star officer who headed the anti-corruption campaign in Afghanistan for me was named H.R. McMaster. I wonder
no
what
kidding.
happened to him. Yeah.
Now, did you deal with, I want to say his name correctly, Yanukovych? Did you deal with Yanukovych at all?
Yes, I met him, interestingly, years earlier when I was serving as Chief of Staff to Secretary of Defense Don Rumsfeld. And we went to Ukraine and had a meeting with Yanukovych, who is a THUG thug. And he is, in his dacha in Moscow now, and I don't think he's coming back anytime soon. I like this President Zelensky. I think he is a breath of fresh air in that country, and I am cautiously optimistic. If we stay with Ukraine, we can help them push back on what's happening in southeastern Ukraine. The one thing that's lost forever, in my view, Hugh, is Crimea. That's not going to come back.
Well, I agree with that, and indeed, Khrushchev gave Crimea to Ukraine.
Exactly.
Am I correct? And so that was historically part of Imperial Russia, and
Absolutely.
It's
And
illegitimate
also,
to use force, but it was certainly not a reversion to something that wasn't a norm for centuries.
That's exactly right, and we ought to remember pre-invasion, the population of Crimea was 80% plus Russian, very supportive of Russia. When I traveled in Crimea as opposed to the rest of Ukraine, you really got to feel that you weren't so much in Ukraine, you were really in a part of Russia. And so I think it's a fait accompli. It's illegal under international law. We ought to condemn it, but realistically, that's not going to get reversed, in my view.
Now, Admiral Stavridis, this is a very difficult question. It took about 5 years after Tiananmen massacre for America and China to get back to normalcy. We're now about 5 years out after the use of illegitimate force to seize Crimea and parts of eastern Ukraine. Is there a rule of history about how long civilized countries punish via sanctions? I don't want to lift the Russian sanctions. I'm just curious if your study of history has revealed a rule under which the world generally adjusts to the reality even after its outrage has been expressed.
I think there's a tactical answer and a strategic answer. I think tactically it probably is about 5 years. That's kind of the cycle of these kinds of things. But I think strategically there are places where the United States, for example, has imposed sanctions on Cuba for decades and decades and decades following a revolution there. So I think if it's a tactical event, a Tiananmen Square, I think that is probably a 5 to 7 year cycle. If it is a regime that is repugnant, like Cuba or North Korea, I think sanctions can go on for decades, and they should.
Last question. Is the Ukrainian military run by professionals or is it run by politicos?
It's run by professionals. Interestingly, many of them were initially trained in the old Soviet Union, although that generation is now bleeding out, and you're starting to see colonels and one-star generals who have served in NATO and been part of the NATO Ukraine operation. So uniformed military, pretty professional, got to stay on them, send money, guns, and lawyers, but stay focused on it, and that can be part of solving the corruption issues in Ukraine.
Admiral James Stavridis, always a pleasure. Thank you, Admiral. Coming right back, America, with Sonny Bunch. Time for the movies, but first time for ReliefFactor.com. If you're looking on TV, there it is. If you're looking right now, there's my little package. If you're watching Town Hall TV or Univision on HughHewitt.com, there's my lukewarm coffee. There are my 4 ReliefFactor.com supplements. In they go. Down they go. Icarian, resveratrol, omega, curcumin. Those 4 natural supplements have been discovered by science over the millennium and by the very good scientists at ReliefFactor.com. The right amount, the right dosage, easy to swallow, easy to open. If you suffer from any aches and pains like arthritis, the normal dings and tears that go with getting old, or you're a weekend warrior getting ready to suit up for this weekend, ReliefFactor.com. I'm walking the battlefield at Fredericksburg tomorrow. I got to be ready to go. Finally going to get to see Fredericksburg. Don't go anywhere, America. It's the Hugh Hewitt Show.
The Hugh Hewitt Show on the Salem Radio Network returns from break in 3 minutes and 15 seconds. The Hugh Hewitt Show on the Salem Radio Network returns from break in 2 minutes and 45 seconds. Hugh Hewitt Show on the Salem Radio Network returns from break in 2 minutes and 15 seconds. The Hugh Hewitt Show on the Salem Radio Network returns from break in 1 minute and 45 seconds. The Hugh Hewitt Show on the Salem Radio Network returns from break in 1 minute and 15 seconds. The Hugh Hewitt Show on the Salem Radio Network returns from break in 45 seconds. The Hugh Hewitt Show on the Salem Radio Network returns from break in 15 seconds. The Hugh Hewitt Show returns from break in 5 minutes.
Welcome back, America. Sonny Bunch is the resident film critic of the Hugh Hewitt Show. Follow him on Twitter at Sonny Bunch. He files his movie reviews all over the place, but you hear him here first. Rambo and Ed Astra. Ed Asner, I didn't know had a movie coming out, Sonny Bunch. Tell us about it.
Ed Asner. It's a very sad movie about Ed Asner's search for his long-dead father. All right, so 2 movies out last weekend that we didn't really get a chance to talk about that we should talk about this weekend because there's not really anything in theaters for adults this weekend. Rambo: Last Blood. We are all familiar with the trials and tribulations of John Vietnam vet who was hounded out of a small town when he was a drifter, and then turned into the great American action star of the 1980s.
Yep.
Going back to Vietnam, going back to Afghanistan, and then kind of doing a freelance adventure in, I forget where exactly it was, Indonesia or Thailand or something. And now he's back in America. He's back in America, and he is trying to rescue his adopted kind of Mexican-American daughter from evil cartel human traffickers south of the border. It's kind of like Taken by way of Mexico, if you're looking for an elevator pitch.
Am I right that this was a grand total of about 50 minutes? It seemed like this was the shortest Rambo movie ever.
It is definitely shorter. It's about 100 minutes. It's a very tight 100 minutes, as they would say. I think the last one was pretty short too. The last one was about 95 or 100 minutes as well. They've really boiled Rambo down to his essence, which is, he is a man of violence who is trying to overcome his demons, but they're more focused on the violence than the demons at this point.
I'm not going to visit his ranch, that's for sure.
Yeah, it's great. So there are a couple of very funny moments in this movie that just kind of betray the lack of understanding of certain things like modern teenagers. Like, for instance, Rambo is trying to convince his young kind of stepdaughter figure to have kids come over to their house for a party. He was like, just come over here. And the daughter's like, we're already doing it at this other girl's house. It's fine. It's all set up. And he's like, show him the tunnels. And this is because he's got a series of tunnels under there. But the idea that these kids would be interested in like coming to look at his weird murder tunnels, yes, is kind of funny all on its own. I don't know. It's not a great movie. The first Rambo remains the best Rambo, and I much prefer that to the kind of Reagan-era cartoony superhero Rambo.
Hugh's views, you get what you pay for. You get exactly what you think you're going to get.
Exactly. It is. This is not a movie that's going to throw a lot of surprises your way. And I have to say, I'm a little disappointed by my fellow film critics who have kind of dismissed it as, MAGA bait, whatever, which is it's a pretty lazy critique of the film, in part because I wrote this for the Washington Post this week, but in part because the idea that, only MAGA Trump supporters should be in favor of John Rambo killing a bunch of cartel members is insane. Cartels are the perfect bipartisan villains of our time. Everyone should hate them.
All right, now the one movie I don't understand, I watched Ad Astra, Touching Mrs. Hewitt, and I went there, and we came out scratching our head that got green-lighted. Tell me about it.
Well, so Ad Astra is it is the latest movie from James Gray, who makes slower films. He made Lost City of Z and The Immigrant, We Own the Night, some other stuff. But it's from a kind of art house-y type director. It stars Brad Pitt about a guy who has to go to the outer reaches of the solar system to find the father who abandoned him and his mother, and also is possibly destroying the world with a antimatter something or other. The movie is kind of two separate movies almost. The first movie is a kind of a space action adventure type film, right? I actually really like the first hour of the movie. The first hour of the movie has some great visuals. It has this great action set piece where Brad Pitt falls off a space antenna and he's got a parachute to the ground. Fantastic stuff. There's a dune buggy chase on the moon. Really great, exciting action beats. And a rescue of a spaceship that has been stalled out in space that I don't want to spoil for you what happens on that, but it's really fantastic. And then the second half of the movie is like 2001: A Space Odyssey light. Like it's even more boring and it is super dull. And I was falling asleep by the end of it. So I really liked the first half. I couldn't stay in the second half. Now, what's interesting about the film is that it is a very personal and almost small picture for a $100 million space movie starring Brad Pitt. It is very internal. The way I described it to some folks was It's kind of like Fight Club movie of like anti-consumerism, daddy issues, but without any of the humor or irony that animates that film.
Well said. I can't tell people to go see it because it's just so dang dull at the end. Sonny Bunch, read everything he writes. He tweets at Sonny Bunch over on Twitter, and he's here every Friday morning, and he did not fail to warn. You are warned. Come back, hour number 2 of the Hugh Hewitt Show straight ahead.
Portions of the Hugh Hewitt Show are brought to you in part by Citizens for Truth in Drug Pricing.
The Hugh Hewitt Show on the Salem Radio Network returns from break in 8 minutes and 15 seconds. The Hugh Hewitt Show on the Salem Radio Network returns from break in 7 minutes and 45 seconds. The Hugh Hewitt Show on the Salem Radio Network returns from break in 7 minutes and 15 seconds. The Hugh Hewitt Show on the Salem Radio Network returns from break in 6 minutes and 45 seconds. The Hugh Hewitt Show on the Salem Radio Network returns from break in 6 minutes and 15 seconds. The Hugh Hewitt Show on the Salem Radio Network returns from break in 5 minutes and 45 seconds. The Hugh Hewitt Show on the Salem Radio Network returns from break in 5 minutes and 15 seconds. The Hugh Hewitt Show on the Salem Radio Network returns from break in 4 minutes and 45 seconds. Hewitt Show on the Salem Radio Network returns from break in 4 minutes and 15 seconds. Hugh Hewitt Show on the Salem Radio Network returns from break in 3 minutes and 45 seconds. The Hugh Hewitt Show on the Salem Radio Network returns from break in 3 minutes and 15 seconds. The Hugh Hewitt Show on the Salem Radio Network returns from break in 2 minutes and 45 seconds. The Hugh Hewitt Show on the Salem Radio Network returns from break in 2 minutes and 15 seconds. The Hugh Hewitt Show on the Salem Radio Network returns from break in 1 minute and 45 seconds. The Hugh Hewitt Show on the Salem Radio Network returns from break in 1 minute and 15 seconds. The Hugh Hewitt Show on the Salem Radio Network returns from break in 45 seconds. The Hugh Hewitt Show on the Salem Radio Network returns from break in 15 seconds. The Hugh Hewitt Show returns from break in 5 seconds.
Morning, glory, America, bonjour, hi, Canada, greetings, everyone. It is Hugh Hewitt. Thank you for listening this morning. I'm inside the Beltway in what is a steamy end of September inside of the Beltway. And I want to begin every show, and I'm going to begin every show for a while by telling you you've got to go pre-order Kimberly Strassel's brand new book, Resistance at All Costs. It is the complete context for this latest, quote, whistleblower, close quote, which is just the latest episode in the effort to take down President Trump. Resistance at all costs. You cannot put it down and not conclude that the whole gang, Comey and McCabe, Strzok, Brennan, everybody, they're complicit allies in the media, have been after Trump since early 2016. They have never let up. They have never stopped. It is ongoing. This is the latest episode. The IG report is coming. This episode is in part, I believe, time to cover that. Emo over at Media Matters. You can write this down. Hewitt believes the enemies that Donald Trump had at the beginning are still there, though many of them have been exposed and some have been indicted and more will be indicted. There are nevertheless incredible connections between what is going on now and what happened from 2016 forward. Kimberly Strassel puts that all out in Resistance at All Costs. Right now, however, the President of the United States has tweeted. The president writes, to show you how dishonest the lamestream media is, I use the word little, not little, in the describing corrupt Congressman Little Adam Schiff. Low-rating CNN purposely took the hyphen out and said I spelled the word little wrong. A small but never-ending situation with CNN. The president is referring to Adam Schiff's absurd pardon for that. Dump that, please. Adam Schiff's absurd hearing yesterday. And so absurd that Generalissimo took to his maestro to give you a Titanic version of Adam Schiff in his many different shifts over the past week. Cut number 25.
At the same time, though, the American people do want us to attack the problem of corruption, and the corruption within the administration is rampant. Well, if that's the case, then why doesn't the president simply release the transcript of that call? And I don't know whether the whistleblower complaint is on this allegation, but if it is, and even if it isn't, why doesn't the president just say release the whistleblower complaint? Clearly, he's afraid for the public to see either one of those things, and we're determined to make sure that the public does. Pick up, you! This is not what's at issue. We're talking about serious or flagrant abuse, impropriety, potential violation of law.
Iceberg, right ahead! Right ahead! Stop!
Damning than I or many others had imagined. It is shocking at another level that the White House would release these notes and felt that somehow this would help the president's case or cause. Because what those notes reflect is a classic mafia-like shakedown of a foreign leader. They reflect a Ukrainian president who was desperate for U.S. support, for military support to help that country in a hot war.
This illicit conduct by the President of the United States
is the essence of what the president communicates. We've been very good to your country, very good. No other country has done as much as we have. But you know what? I don't see much reciprocity here. I hear what you want. I have a favor I want from you, though. And I'm going to say this only 7 times, so you better listen good. I want you to make up dirt on my political opponent, understand lots of it. I'm going to put you in touch with people, and not just any people. I'm going to put you in touch with Attorney General of the United States, my Attorney General, Bill Barr. got the whole weight of the American law enforcement behind him. And I'm going to put you in touch with Rudy. You're going to love him, trust me.
Hey, Sonny, how about a little ice?
Yes, ma'am, I'll bring it. You know what I'm asking, and so I'm only going to say this a few more times, in a few more ways. And by the way, don't call me again. I'll call you when you've done what I asked.
Not the time. Enter it in the log.
It would be funny if it wasn't such a graphic portrayal of the president's oath of office. My summary of the president's call was meant to be at least part in parody.
No, I think everyone understood, and my GOP colleagues may feign otherwise.
In fact, I want to use Chairman Schiff's own words to describe this Democrat majority. A parody.
Adam Schiff totally sunk his own credibility by lying about what was in the transcript yesterday. But that's just par for the course. He went on with CNN with Adam after getting blistered on Twitter all day. Yesterday, Twitter was just like the shootout at the OK Corral. I had lefties coming after me because Tom Cotton came in and discussed Hunter Biden on the show, and I posted the audio and transcript. An alleged journalist objected to my posting. How dare you? How dare I post a transcript and audio of an interview I did? The town loves Joe Biden. The town is protecting Joe Biden and Hunter Biden, who took $50,000 a month from a Ukrainian oil company, doesn't speak Ukraine. There's a lot about Hunter Biden. Joe Biden is sinking like a stone because of what he said to the Council on Foreign Relations. Cut number 26, by the way.
I was, not but it just happened to be that was the assignment I got. I got all the good ones. So I got Ukraine. And I remember going over convincing our team, or others too, convincing us that we should be providing for loan guarantees. And I went over for, I guess, the 12th, 13th time to Kyiv, and I was supposed to announce that there was another $1 billion loan guarantee. And I had gotten a commitment from Poroshenko and from Yatsenyuk that they would take action against the state prosecutor, and they didn't. So they said they were walking out to press conference. I said, no, I said, we're not going to give you the $1 billion. They said, you have no authority. You're not the president. The president said. I said, call him. I said, I'm telling you, you're not getting the $1 billion. I said, you're not getting the $1 billion. I'm going to be leaving here. And I think it was, 6 hours? I said, I'm leaving in 6 hours. If the prosecutor's not fired, you're not getting the money. Well, son of a bitch. Got fired.
Now, that is the Achilles heel of Joe Biden. He's sinking like a stone because people realize he's a blowhard. He is doing exactly what Donald Trump is being accused of having done but did not do in the Zelensky phone call. And yet they're running up the impeachment hill. Why are they doing so? Because the grassroots is crazy. The rest of the country is sitting back and saying, are you out of your mind? I want to go back to Lindsey Graham and what Lindsey Graham said about this yesterday. Cut number 20.
The president was between a rock and a hard place. I think he did the right thing. You know, I'll make my own opinions up, and I have, and I'm really clear about this. This phone call is a nothing burger in terms of a quid pro quo. The President of the United States did not remotely suggest to the Ukraine, if you don't do my political bidding against the Bidens, I'm going to cut your money off. He talked to me last night about South Korea needs to pay more. Maybe we should withhold money from South Korea. I said, they probably should pay more, but we shouldn't withhold money because that sends a bad signal to China.
Go and get Kimberly Straussel's book, Resistance at All Costs. Go and get it. It is the perfect scene setter. It begins in 2015. It talks about Comey and McCabe and Strzok and Brennan and everybody else in the media and Adam Schiff. And it puts into context this latest episode, and it really sets up what we're all waiting for, the Inspector General's report, and I hope indictments from U.S. Attorney Durham in Connecticut. You haven't heard Bill Barr say anything because Bill Barr, incorruptible and implacable, unperturbable, is coming. Stay tuned, America. It's the Hugh Hewitt Show.
Portions of the Hugh Hewitt Show are brought to you in part by Birch Gold Group.
The Hugh Hewitt Show on the Salem Radio Network returns from break in 4 minutes and 15 seconds. The Hugh Hewitt Show on the Salem Radio Network returns from break in 3 minutes and 45 seconds. The Hugh Hewitt Show on the Salem Radio Network returns from break in 3 minutes and 15 seconds. The Hugh Hewitt Show on the Salem Radio Network returns from break in 2 minutes and 45 seconds. The Hugh Hewitt Show on the Salem Radio Network returns from break in 2 minutes and 15 seconds. The Hugh Hewitt Show on the Salem Radio Network returns from break in 1 minute and 45 seconds. The Hugh Hewitt Show on the Salem Radio Network returns from break in 1 minute and 15 seconds. The Hugh Hewitt Show on the Salem Radio Network returns from break in 45 seconds. The Hugh Hewitt Show on the Salem Radio Network returns from break in 15 seconds. The Hugh Hewitt Show turns from break in 5 seconds.
Tarzana Joe. Hello, Joe.
Hello, Hugh. You know, I sense a lot of legal wrangling approaching, which means I have to go and dig out 3 years of notes from Father Callahan's classes. The politics of language seems to go through paths and phases, and it seems to me we're living through the time of Latin phrases, where the Congress is deciding if the president should go for engaging in discussions touching on a quid pro quo, while ignoring in their frenzy what his adversary did, which when looked at a priori sure sounds like a quo pro quid. Or if Hunter had a problem, sure as shooting Joe would fix it, and this isn't any rumor, we all heard it, ipsy-dixit. Then some senators wrote letters where they tried to up the ante. One was signed by old Pat Leahy, and we caught him in flagranti. Yes, I read the pseudo-transcript, and I'm sorry, truth to tell, I see no legal explanation for the current casus belli. Sure, the papers have opinions, and the editors will write them, but I don't think they will sway me if they write ad infinitum. Well, the planet's in a crisis, and the polar bear's bereft, and we only have 9 years, 6 months, and 40 minutes left. How can Congress be distracted, their heads buried in the sand, when there's borders to be opened, guns to seize, and bottles banned? The radicals are happy. AOC sure thinks it's neato, but if I were Miss Pelosi, I would exercise my veto. Yes, I'm open to discussion, and I'll happily relax if my idiot opponents cease ad hominem attacks. That's 3 years of Latin for this poem by Tarzana Joe.
You know, that's a show-off poem. I could do a lot more of the usayo if I wanted to and pull my wheellock out, but I'm a modest man, Tarzana Joe.
I am not.
You are not. But will that be posted at tarzanajoe.com?
But of course.
And all your poetry needs available by writing Joe, Tarzana Joe at Reagan.com, Tarzana Joe at Reagan.com. Thank you, Joe.
Thank you, you.
It is a remarkable thing that we've got all this Latin floating around. We don't need Latin, though, to talk about what D.N.I. McGuire did yesterday. He took apart the whistleblower. It hasn't stopped the Democrats. Don't get me wrong. They are going forward. Donald Trump commented yesterday on what's happening on the tarmac in New York. Cut number 19.
Hello, everybody. I just watched a little bit of this on television. It's a disgrace to our country. It's another witch hunt. Here we go again. It's Adam Schiff and his crew making up stories and sitting there like pious, whatever you want to call them. It's just really a disgrace. It's a terrible thing for our country. They can't do any work. They're frozen, the Democrats. They're going to lose the election. They know it. That's why they're doing it. And it should never be allowed what's happened to this president. And despite that, I think I've done just about more than any president in his first 2.5 years in office. If you look, I think you'll see very few could compete with the things we've done for our military, for the economy. We have the best economy anywhere in the world, by far. We've rebuilt our military. We've done so many things that are so incredible with tax cuts and regulations. And I have to put up with Adam Schiff on an absolutely perfect phone call to the new president of Ukraine. That was a perfect call. But Adam Schiff doesn't talk about Joe Biden and his son walking away with millions of dollars from Ukraine and then millions of dollars from China, walking away in a quick meeting, walking away with millions of dollars. He doesn't talk about Joe Biden firing a prosecutor. And if that prosecutor's not fired, he's not going to give him money from the United States of America. They don't talk about that. My call was perfect. The president yesterday of Ukraine said there was no pressure put on him whatsoever, none whatsoever. And he said it loud and clear for the press. What these guys are doing, Democrats are doing to this country, is a disgrace, and it shouldn't be allowed. There should be a way of stopping it, maybe legally through the courts, but they're going to tie up our country. We can't talk about gun regulation. We can't talk about anything because, frankly, they're so tied up, they're so screwed up, nothing gets done except when I do it. I'm using Mexico to protect our border because the Democrats won't change loopholes in asylum. When you think of that, and I want to thank Mexico, 27,000 soldiers they have. But think of how bad that is. Think of it. Where we use
I'm coming right back with more Donald Trump, more General Mattis, more Hunter Biden. A listener just sent me a New Yorker profile of Hunter Biden from July, which I hadn't seen. The whistleblower has made Hunter Biden famous. He shot at Donald Trump and he hit Joe and Hunter Biden. Stay tuned, America. It's the Hugh Hewitt Show.
Portions of the Hugh Hewitt Show are brought to you in part by Citizens for Truth in Drug Pricing.
The Hugh Hewitt Show on the Salem Radio Network returns from break in 5 minutes and 15 seconds. Hugh Hewitt Show on the Salem Radio Network returns from break in 4 minutes and 45 seconds. The Hugh Hewitt Show on the Salem Radio Network returns from break in 4 minutes and 15 seconds. The Hugh Hewitt Show on the Salem Radio Network returns from break in 3 minutes and 45 seconds. The Hugh Hewitt Show on the Salem Radio Network returns from break in 3 minutes and 15 seconds. The Hugh Hewitt Show on the Salem Radio Network returns from break in 2 minutes and 45 seconds. The Hugh Hewitt Show on the Salem Radio Network returns from break in 2 minutes and 15 seconds. The Hugh Hewitt Show on the Salem Radio Network returns from break in 1 minute and 45 seconds. The Hugh Hewitt Show on the Salem Radio Network returns from break in 1 minute and 15 seconds. Hewitt Show on the Salem Radio Network returns from break in 45 seconds. The Hugh Hewitt Show on the Salem Radio Network returns from break in 15 seconds. The Hugh Hewitt Show returns from break in 5 seconds.
Well, America, I think we all know the most important story this weekend. I think we all would agree. Tampa Bay Rays are at 95-64. The Indians are at 93-66. The Indians have to win out. They got to win 3 games. The Rays have got to lose 3 games. And then the Indians go to the wild card with the A's. I will be at Nationals Park on Sunday. I don't care what it'll cost. If we get down to the last game, I'm going to be there. I promised you, and I'm going to finish it now. General Mattis stayed a long time with me after the show yesterday. You've never heard this before because I didn't air it yesterday. I haven't posted it. Now the entire audio and transcript of both my interview with General Mattis a week ago and my interview of General Mattis yesterday are posted at hughhewitt.com. Here's the conclusion of that second interview. General Mattis, staying on this theme, you write at length in Call Sign Chaos about you reaping the benefits of people who planned on sea lift capacity a generation before you got your stars when you invaded Afghanistan. And right now, the new National Security Advisor, Robert O'Brien, is a huge proponent of President Trump's plan for a 355-ship Navy. I think one of the advantages of Call Sign Chaos is you drive home 25 years from now, the next Mattis is going to be fighting with whatever we provide today. I'm not sure our Congress is that forward-looking anymore.
Well, we do seem to watch in Washington, D.C. as they're consumed by near-term and immediate issues, perhaps a real lack of nonpartisanship when we face certain challenges. But remember, last December, 87% of the House and the Senate, Republican and Democrat, voted for the highest military budget in terms of raw dollars that we've had. So I believe there is a degree of bipartisanship or nonpartisanship when it comes to defense. We are going to see a more naval or maritime strategy as our military strategy. I think this is simply a reality as we deal with the changing world. So we must watch closely the size of the U.S. Navy and make certain that our naval forces are equipped to be the lead element. Of course, we need the Army, the Air Force, the Marines there as part of a joint effort. But we will have to watch and make certain that what we're turning over is a military capable of protecting this experiment we call America 20 years from now, because we can't be in a position where we think 3.1 or 3.6%, if you include the Veterans Administration, is exorbitant in terms of defense. We can afford survival in America. We also have to make sure our allies are doing their fair share, and that's where we have a continuing effort by the Trump administration to try to take countries like Korea or Western Europe that were admittedly bombed flat in World War II or on their backs economically. They're no longer on their backs, and all the democracies have to pitch in. We can't just say the American taxpayer is going to pay this bill. All the democracies are going to have to work together for their own common defense. But I think we can afford it. And I would just say that the Congress can be persuaded if we have a good strategic argument. I wouldn't say that the fringe elements of either party can be, but certainly the bulk of the Congress can be persuaded if we have a sound strategy that makes sense to the American Congress, the American people.
Let's conclude our conversation about Call Sign Chaos, General, by talking about the Battle of Fallujah. Specifically, you warn again and again that Washington, D.C. decision makers cannot presume to know what's going on a battlefield, no matter how refined the modern tools of communication, no matter how close it appears on the computer screen, they're not there. And the Battle of Fallujah, the first Battle of Fallujah, may be the most frustrated you are in call sign chaos. Can you explain why and how the aura of omniscience back in Washington, D.C., or in this case, Coalition Provisional Headquarters, led to what was a very bad result in the first Battle of Fallujah?
Well, what happened in Fallujah was that we had some civilian contractors who got basically into an area they shouldn't have been in. They were killed, 4 of them. Their bodies desecrated, burned, and hung from bridges. We knew in Fallujah that it was a tribal town, so we would be able to find members of tribes that disagreed with what had happened, disagreed vehemently. We would recover the bodies, return them to their loved ones. But we also had photographs, and we had our spies in the town who could guide us to hunt down the guys who had done it and take them out. I did not want to do a full-scale assault on the town because we were under troop caps at this time. I did not have enough troops to do it right, to seal off the town. Eventually I was ordered to go in. We had to evacuate the people. And I said, okay, those are the orders. I got it. I knew that my military chain of command had recommended we allow the operation to proceed as I recommended. Instead, I was ordered to go in, and I said, okay, let's get on with it. Those are the orders. They're not called likes. They're called orders. I didn't have to like it. But the bottom line was I said, but don't stop me. Once we start into that city, don't stop me. So we got over 300,000 people out of the city. The terrorists were numerous. We were attacking in the city, and deep inside the city, due to a lot of public releases of information, some of it true, much of it untrue, by the adversary, basically, politically, we were stopped, even though I had the support 2-3 levels above me in the military chain of command. We were stopped deep inside the city. I was ordered to negotiate with the adversaries there, the ones who represented them anyway. They weren't the terrorists themselves, they were their minions. And then eventually I was ordered out of the city. We warned at that time we'll have to go back in, but we handed a moral victory to the enemy, who then their recruiting, their fundraising picked up, and it was a real setback. And as my troops were being withdrawn, I remember one young lad being filthy dirty, being interviewed about how terrible this was, that they'd lost their buddies, they were being forced to fall back, and he must feel terrible, and he just looks calmly into the camera and he says, it doesn't matter, we'll hunt him down somewhere else and kill him. And that's an example of what happens when the troops keep faith with you. They knew we'd fought not to do this, and they did not take it in a way that they would lower their morale. I was amazed at how they kept faith with us. But unfortunately, Hugh, we did have to go back in months after I'd left Iraq, and we took hundreds of killed and wounded in order to take the city. And now the terrorists had time to really prepare, to stockpile ammunition, to build bunkers inside houses. So, yes, it was a very frustrating time. And I think it's a reminder that policymakers have to set an achievable end state. And then once you make the commitment to go into a fight, you cannot stop halfway. You can't go wobbly at that point. You've got to finish it as quickly as possible on your own terms.
If you're going to take Vienna, take Vienna. You don't use the PG-13 of Napoleon in call sign chaos. Very last question, General. Is my business, journalism, are we up to the task of cooperating without being compromised with military campaigns, because we're in the business of getting clicks and stories read that sometimes works to the great disadvantage of people whose lives are on the line? Do you see us reconciling that tension?
I do not. I accept that under our Constitution, the press, to do its job, does not even need to be fair or accurate. I accept that, although I think many people in the responsible press, and I find them across the political spectrum, there's representatives of responsible press, they do try to get it right. And there are some that actually have been aware of classified information and have not printed it in a manner that would cost us casualties. But the press is so amorphous now. There's the good, the bad, and the ugly. And what we need to do as members of the government is make certain that we're working with the responsible members, even when they're reporting something that's uncomfortable for us, and do our best to keep them close so that they get full transparency, at least to the degree we can. There are some things you simply have to classify or we'll fail. A raid to capture, kill bin Laden. We could not announce that in advance, and nobody would have expected us to. But there are many people in the press, I think, who, if they had heard about it, would not have announced it. But there are others who, you're right, they would have. So the press manifests itself one person, one man, one woman at a time, and people should have to live with the reputations as far as I'm concerned. And I'll do my best to always open doors to members of the press. I did so when I was on active duty. I remember with 1st Marine Division and 23,000 troops, I had over 100 members of the press embedded among them. I was that confident that what they would see would be heartening for the American people and the global audience. So it's got the good, the bad, and the ugly, just like every human organization, Hugh.
Well, the call sign Chaos recounts a lot of good, and I appreciate that. I appreciate the book. General Mattis, you've been very generous with your time. Thank you. Congratulations on a bestseller, and thank you for your service to the country over, 5 decades.
Hey, thanks very much, Hugh. It's good talking with you. Good luck to you.
Thank you. Both of the interviews last week and this week are at HughHewitt.com. Time for the pre-market report. Talk about chaos. If chaos hits the world, gold goes up. This pre-market report is brought to you by Birch Gold Group. You can go to birchgold.com/Hugh, birchgold.com/Hugh, or text Hugh to 474747. When I buy gold, I buy it from Birch. Canadian gold, Maple Leafs, Krugerrands, American Eagles. Get yourself some real metal, or put a portion of your IRA, your 401k, into a gold or precious metal backed, physically held IRA. You can get a comprehensive 16-page kit on how to do that by sending Hugh, H-U-G-H, to 474747, or you can buy gold just by going to birchgold.com. This morning, the futures are all green. S&P up 8, NASDAQ up 16, Dow up 57. Gold this morning is at 1,500. Quite a bargain point to enter right now. The 10-year Treasury down to 1.68%. Gold at 1,500. Oil is down to 55.83. Going to be a quiet open out there, but gold, a good point to get in if you want to add some to your holdings, either physically in your possession or via your IRA. Go to birchgold.com/Hugh. While you're online, 2 other things. Go to drugpricingtruth.com. That's from my sponsor, Citizens for Truth and Drug Pricing. They are in a knockdown big battle with Big Pharma. They are trying to bring transparency and patent reform that every user of prescription drugs that have skyrocketed, like insulin, should be in the battle, fighting for your own peace of mind, your future financial security, by making prescription drugs not susceptible to patent manipulation. It's a bipartisan issue, not one of these crazy impeachment deals. Democrats and Republicans are actually working to get this done. You can help by going to drugpricingtruth.com. Send that link to 10 friends. Get in the game, drugpricingtruth.com. You really do have to be a participant, drugpricingtruth.com. And my reminder about relieffactor.com. 3 times a day I tell you, 3 times a day I warn you. If you leave the house without your relieffactor.com, you're asking for back pain, you're asking for knee pain. If you got a long commute, you're up in the Bay Area. I just got my spring numbers. My gosh, do I have a huge audience in the Bay Area early in the morning. And it's because the commutes are so long. And I'm glad to be there with you. I am sympathetic to you. It's been for a long time the case in Los Angeles that people are on the way from 4:30 on the Inland Empire driving into the city. But if you're hurting on that drive, you should be taking relieffactor.com. If you're struggling with arthritis every day, you're struggling with, getting the peanut butter down, relieffactor.com supports the temporary relief of the minor aches and pains using nature's supplements. Don't do the guesswork. Don't go down to the GNC. Just start tossing stuff into your shopping cart. No. Let the scientists at relieffactor.com do it for you. $19.95 is the starter pack. Eliana Johnson from the Free Beacon is next.
Hugh Hewitt Show on the Salem Radio Network returns from break in 3 minutes and 15 seconds. The Hugh Hewitt Show on the Salem Radio Network returns from break in 2 minutes and 45 seconds. Hugh Hewitt Show on the Salem Radio Network returns from break in 2 minutes and 15 seconds. The Hugh Hewitt Show on the Salem Radio Network returns from break in 1 minute and 45 seconds. The Hugh Hewitt Show on the Salem Radio Network returns from break in 1 minute and 15 seconds. The Hugh Hewitt Show on the Salem Radio Network returns from break in 45 seconds. The Hugh Hewitt Show on the Salem Radio Network returns from break in 15 seconds. The Hugh Hewitt Show returns from break in 5 seconds.
Welcome back, America. I'm Hugh Hewitt, the big boss of the Washington Free Beacon. Eliana Y. Johnson joins me now. You ought to be following her at Eliana Y. Johnson. Good morning, Eliana. How are you?
Good morning, Hugh. I'm great. How are you?
I'm great because the Free Beacon ran a parody of Mike Barbaro. Now, I honestly have to admit, I have no idea who Mike Barbaro is. I had to get filled in that he runs a podcast for the New York Times. What a surprise. I don't listen to the New York Times podcast. But he came after me yesterday because I posted the audio and transcript of an interview with Tom Cotton about Hunter Biden, and he thought I was attacking the vice president's child. So the Free Beacon people went after him for calling a 49-year-old, apparently corrupt individual a child. I don't know much about Hunter Biden, but what in the world is going on with the rally around Joe and Hunter Biden movement in this city?
Yeah, I do think it is a little bit silly, particularly after the New Yorker ran that profile, which was really incredible. I think you said earlier that you hadn't read it yet, but I would encourage everyone to read it. It's an incredible profile that chronicles Hunter's really troubled life, and I think it does call into question, given his troubles, why a Ukrainian company would hire him on its board. But yeah, certainly there is, I mean, you've seen it in the media now, a move to say that he is beyond criticism, which I think is silly. He's a 50-year-old grown man.
Yeah, and he is part of the Ukrainian corruption story. I mean, this is just one story to me about whether or not the president did something wrong, whether Joe Biden did something wrong, whether Hunter Biden ought to have been on. Elizabeth Warren got strung up on this yesterday. She got asked by a reporter, would your vice president's children be allowed to serve on foreign boards? And she went, abba, dabba, dabba, dabba. Do you think that Joe Biden has been damaged by this story? Did the whistleblower shoot at Trump, and whether or not he hit Trump, hit Biden in the process?
I'm not sure whether Biden has been damaged. I think Biden was trending downward in the polls before the story came out, and I do think it will be interesting to see whether this story helped or hurt him. To me, it seemed like Warren was going to be the nominee before this even came out. It wasn't clear to me in the New York Times' excellent reporting on this whether Biden himself had problems with this story, but it was clear that, of course, this company had hired Hunter Biden to curry political favor with his father. I think it was Senator John Kennedy who said a couple days ago in an interview, where do you think they found his name? On ZipRecruiter? Of course, they hired him for this reason. Not clear to me, what strings he pulled and whether, how much knowledge Biden had of it. So not clear to me that Biden did anything wrong here. But of course, it's the sort of seamy political insidery stuff, actually, that Trump ran against in 2016.
Yeah. Now, I got to talk to you about, I was on the Acela yesterday, riveted by Kimberly Strassel's new book, Resistance at All Costs. Not because it's got any breathtaking new revelations, although I haven't finished, I got a chapter to go, but because it organizes in one place the campaign against Donald Trump that began in March of 2016 at the highest levels of the FBI, takes us through every episode. And I think it's arriving just as the IG report and this whistleblower report comes. Eliana, do we have our arms around yet? No, I don't believe there's a deep state, but the cabal against Donald Trump?
I haven't read the book, so I really can't speak to that. But it does seem to me like, I have to say, I don't think Trump acted, shouldn't have said what he said on the call. Not clear to me that it's an impeachable offense either, but, the deep state, I think it is a thing in the sense that a lot of the people who work in the federal government are, liberals who are opposed to Trump and would very much like to see him impeached. So, of course, it's not a formalized thing that where they go and meet every morning and talk about how to make it happen. But, most of the people working in this government are have political views opposed to the president and very much don't like him. And the president has not figured out how to work with those people. And that's something that, he should have brought more people into his administration who know how to make the government work for him.
And there's obviously people at the NSC who are after him. President tweeted 13 minutes ago that Representative Adam Schiff fraudulently read to Congress with millions of people watching a version of my conversation that doesn't exist. He was supposedly reading an exact transcript. He got caught. He was desperate, and he got caught. Do you think Schiff intended to be believed when he read that? Because I think he did, and I do think he got caught. And I think that's sort of a preview of coming attractions in the impeachment circus.
Yeah, that's a good question. I assumed that he didn't. I thought it was supposed to be some sort of a parody thing, but I'm not sure. I guess now that Trump says that, what was going on there? Elise Stefanik said later in the hearing that, of course, this was, not a real transcript, and so she seemed to think that he was making it up and that it wasn't intended to be believed. But yeah, I'm not sure. I guess now that you say that.
Very quickly, Eliana, I want impeachment voted on. I want it to get going. Put it on the record. I'm all in favor of it because it's going to be a clown show. Do you think it's going to happen?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's going to happen, and I think it'll happen, around Thanksgiving. I think that I think just as you want it to move along, the Democrats want it to move along because they don't want it to come too close to when Democrats start voting in the primary.
Interesting. Eliana Johnson. Follow her on Twitter at Eliana Y. Johnson. Dr. Larry Arnn is next, America. Stay tuned.
The Hugh Hewitt Show on the Salem Radio Network returns from break in 8 minutes and 15 seconds. The Hugh Hewitt Show on the Salem Radio Network returns from break in 7 minutes and 45 seconds. The Hugh Hewitt Show on the Salem Radio Network returns from break in 7 minutes and 15 seconds. The Hugh Hewitt Show on the Salem Radio Network returns from break in 6 minutes and 45 seconds. The Hugh Hewitt Show on the Salem Radio Network returns from break in 6 minutes and 15 seconds. The Hugh Hewitt Show on the Salem Radio Network returns from break in 5 minutes and 45 seconds. The Hugh Hewitt Show on the Salem Radio Network returns from break in 5 minutes and 15 seconds. The Hugh Hewitt Show on the Salem Radio Network returns from break in 4 minutes and 45 seconds. The Hugh Hewitt Show on the Salem Radio Network returns from break in 4 minutes and 15 seconds. The Hugh Hewitt Show on the Salem Radio Network returns from break in 3 minutes and 45 seconds. The Hugh Hewitt Show on the Salem Radio Network returns from break in 3 minutes and 15 seconds. Hugh Hewitt Show on the Salem Radio Network returns from break in 2 minutes and 45 seconds. The Hugh Hewitt Show on the Salem Radio Network returns from break in 2 minutes and 15 seconds. The Hugh Hewitt Show on the Salem Radio Network returns from break in 1 minute and 45 seconds. The Hugh Hewitt Show on the Salem Radio Network returns from break in 1 minute and 15 seconds. Hugh Hewitt Show on the Salem Radio Network returns from break in 45 seconds. The Hugh Hewitt Show on the Salem Radio Network returns from break in 15 seconds. Hewitt Show returns from break in 5 seconds.
Morning glory, America. Bonjour, hi, Canada. It's Hugh Hewitt. That music means it's time for the Hillsdale Dialogue. Once a week, we go very high or very far back, or in this case, to very fundamental things with Dr. Larry Arnn, president of Hillsdale College, or Dean Matthew Spalding, who is head of the new Graduate School of Government at the Kirby Center in Washington, D.C., as he was here last week. But this week, we were going to go back to Homer. But in the last 72 hours, the fundamental things that are afoot that Dr. Arnn has been talking about have broken out both in the United Kingdom and in the United States in ways I just did not see coming. Dr. Larry Arnn, good morning. Thank you for joining us. I actually think we are at a crossroads.
Yeah, well, we may have made the mistake of thinking that one can never see things coming these days. It is a bit, it's here in this. How long has this been going on? 10 days or a week? It looks like a storm in a teacup, but it's a big storm for a teacup storm. It's amazing to me.
And I want to begin in Great Britain and then come to the United States. We're supposed to do an introduction to Homer at the end of this, and I will if it's the natural flow. But I want people to understand, if they're tuning in for the first time in Bloomington or in Fort Myers, Dr. Arnn is a Churchill scholar. Dr. Arnn is the president of Hillsdale College. We have been doing these since 2013. They're all at hughforhillsdale.com. And he knows his British Parliament history. In fact, he sent me a long email about a man I had never, ever heard of before. Lord Justice Hewitt. No relation, though I wish I was. Tell us a little bit about him as a setup for what we talk about as the power grab by the British Supreme Court this week.
Well, he's a guy who he was born in 1870, died in 1943, and he was, the Chief Justice for a while, and a senior cabinet member on the law. He was Attorney General, too. And what's interesting, a lot of things interesting about him, but one of them is, in 1929, he published a soliloquy of the ardent bureaucrat, the amateur of the new despotism, and it's just a prediction of the administrative state. It says that the only persons fit to govern are experts. He sounds like me, by the way. The experts in the art of government are permanent officials who exhibit ancient and too much neglected virtue, worthy of great things. And then it says, got to find this point. The two main obstacles to the rule of experts is the sovereignty of Parliament, and the other is the rule of law.
They're big obstacles.
Big obstacles, right? And he says that they will overcome these things extensively through the law courts. Then eventually, if the expert can get rid of the Lord Chancellor, now the Lord Chancellor used to be he used to preside over the House of Lords and was the senior law lord. And let me break up here. So the point is, how do the courts work in Britain? The short answer is nobody knows anymore. But the way they used to work was there was a complicated system down below that was different for England, Scotland, and Wales. But it all issued up finally to the House of Lords, where there were law lords. They sat in a certain place, and they called the woolsack. That's what the cushions were made out of. And they were lifetime appointments, and they were specialists, and they were high judges. And so you got there by being a member of the aristocracy, although often somebody was appointed to a peerage so he could be one of the law lords. And so that's the way it ran. And then in 2005, Tony Blair fixed it all, so to speak.
Huh.
And so, and he did. I mean, Tony Blair, it just shows, where they'd come, because this is all ancient. And it's interesting when you read articles about that, you'll see that they still use much of the old terminology. But Tony Blair asked for the resignation of every member of the House of Lords and said he was going to change it. And how he's going to change it, we'll figure that out later. And they, in some ways, rationalized the court. So now there's a, what's it called? I got to go look up the name. It's the Supreme Court of the United Kingdom, and it's the ultimate appeal court. There are also ultimate appeal courts for Scotland, and this one, and England and Wales. And you'll remember. So first of all, Boris Johnson prorogues Parliament. He puts it off, and they always do that, by the way, when they're getting ready for an election, and that's usually 6 weeks, and this was 12 weeks, I think he prorogued it for, and so that's unlawful, and they sue in Scotland, and the opponents of Johnson win in Scotland. And they sue in England, and they lose in England, and the opinion in England is, in the English High Court, is very clear. I like it. And what it says is prorogations of Parliament have always been used for direct political advantage.
Yes.
And so, and here's the point. I guess the nub of all of this is this: the British Constitution is not like ours. People say that the difference is it evolved over a long time, which is certainly true. But it's also true that it comes from a different place. Because our Constitution, our form, to understand that, when is the highest authority in the United States is the people of the United States, as they're organized under the Constitution. And so they wanted a new Constitution in America because the old Constitution had been passed by the Confederation Congress. And that meant that Congress had made the Constitution, and that meant that logically the Congress could change it. And so our supremacy of the Constitution comes from that fact, which the founders very much wanted. They couldn't do that in England in 1789 because England was not popularly ruled, only partly popularly ruled. And those weren't the principles. So what happened instead in England was through a long process of deposing and beheading kings and warring factions. Step by step, it went from the power of the crown to the power of the crown in Parliament, ultimately really to the power of the Parliament, and ultimately really the House of Commons. And so these law lords over in the House of Lords were an important survivor of all of that, because you want your judges to serve long-term and be neutral and not subject to the whims of politics. However, these great acts that form the British Constitution are all acts of Parliament, and that means, in principle, Parliament can change them. Parliament could repeal the Magna Carta, and it was the king and his barons who met together and passed that thing. And so that means that there is no appeal outside, ultimately, in principle, the crown, the queen, the sovereign, operating through Parliament. And so now Tony Blair comes along and creates this new thing called the Supreme Court of the United Kingdom, which is patterned after our Supreme Court, I guess. And this lady, Brenda Hale is her name, who's the head of it, the president of it, she's called now. She rules that Boris Johnson's proroguing of Parliament is illegitimate. And the grounds are that it diminishes the parliamentary scrutiny of the executive. That's the chief one. And so now here's Boris's position, right? If you've got a narrow majority, so the British people passed Brexit 52-48. That's reasonably close, but also the most votes for leaving the European Union that have ever been cast for anything in the history of Britain. And so all the parties publicly pledged to implement the vote of the people, and the Tory party, which had called for the referendum, was in power, and they elected Theresa May, who had been against leaving the European Union. She said she would implement it. She did that ham-fistedly. Along the way, she called an election. She hardly mentioned Brexit during the election. Her majority was narrowed to the place where she had to have coalition partners to rule. And they stumble around, right? And then in open disgust, the Conservative Party, and that means the majority of the Conservative members of Parliament, the Tories in Parliament, but also they have a system for polling the districts now. And in both places, Boris Johnson won hands down. And he won in part because everybody longs for clarity.
The clarity, and I want this to be clear as we go into the break. The Magna Carta is 1215. Parliament has been around since the 1300. This is the first time in the history of the sceptered isle that a court has told the Prime Minister that he cannot prorogue Parliament. It's genuinely a first thing, and I'll be back to talk about it with Dr. Larry Arnn right after this. Stay tuned.